Welcome back to Think Design Work Smart. I'm Alex Bolboaca and I'm coming at you from the Mozaic Works studios. And what I have for you today is a quick pass through 3 criteria for decomposing user stories, for splitting user stories into smaller user stories. I've noticed this to be again and again a big problem for software teams, particularly those teams that are used with project management, where you need to do a task. It only makes sense if it's complete, it's a requirement, it's a complete feature. It doesn't make sense to split it because our customer asks for the full thing. And this doesn't make sense anymore once you switch to product development, because the way of thinking when you are building products is you no longer have requirements, you have hypotheses. And one of your hypotheses could be expressed as follows. We assume that if we implement this feature, then we'll get X number of extra users, or we'll get those users to upgrade to a better plan, or things like that. So you start from a hypothesis instead of starting from requirements. And now the question is, how do we get to a point where we can actually test this hypothesis? And there are a few things you can do. First of all, you can take this as a question and say, okay, so we want to increase from, 5 million to 6 million paid users. What could we do here? And then you start exploring this through a technique called impact mapping. You might go into product discovery sessions where you look at this problem, you formulate it as a question saying, how might we convince these users to upgrade to a premium plan? And then you start going into discovery session, you end up with prototypes that you can test quickly for value, or for if the users really find them compelling at the first glance. So once you figure that out, the next step is, okay, we have this complex flow. Now we have validated that at least a part of the users who will follow this will do what we would like from them. But how about we nonetheless test some more? So in order to do that, what I found very useful, particularly for large flows, for complex flows, is to use a technique called user story mapping, where you map the user flow first, and then you think at each step of the user flow, what's the smallest increment that makes sense? And then what would be the next, and you kind of think how that increment would grow, how that step in the flow could grow. And then you group those steps into increments that make sense together. Because one of the challenges of linear backlogs, when you have a list of stories, is that you no longer have the context in a complex flow. So this technique called user story mapping is extremely useful to deal with that. And now there's the kicker. The smallest implementation for each of the steps is to do nothing, right? In fact, if you would be able to have the whole flow without implementing anything, then you have infinite productivity, so you are extremely effective. Now, of course, we cannot do that, but it's worth thinking that the simplest implementation for each step in the flow is do nothing. and consider what's the minimum part that you need to implement from the rest, because you will need to implement something in order to get feedback to validate that this is a feature that people use or want to use. And once the next criteria that you can use, so first do nothing, another criteria, 0, 1, 2 more. I've worked recently with a team that had something like we want to, for a specific application, for the user to be able to add multiple devices to it. Okay, so then how about we start with the ability to add one device? It doesn't make sense to think about adding 0 device, because the core of the feature was the ability to add devices. So you already have add 0 device. So how about just the ability to add one device? And then we started thinking, okay, so what kind of devices do we want to support? And we ended up with a specific device that we can prioritize, we can put first. And then another type of device, and then another type of device. And then you can consider about adding 2 devices and so on, right? And maybe 2 different devices, and maybe 2 devices of the same, from the same category, and so on. And so it can get really complicated in time, but you just go step by step by step. And the goal is to validate and to get the feedback loops, not only at the user level. You definitely want the feedback loop at the user level, for the users to basically vote with their wallets and say, okay, I'm going to get this plan because I can add these many devices, and it's really helpful for me. But you also want to get the cycles of feedback going in the development. In this case, if you want to add a specific device that will give you a certain technical certain technical set of challenges, and then when you consider another device from the same category, you again will have a specific set of challenges. Maybe some of them you already encountered, maybe some of them are just new, and you just solve a small set of challenges at a time, and so on. So you get this feedback loop inside your system, not only for the people, but also for the technology. How easy it is to add this new thing, and so on. And instead of considering the whole thing, how about we start with a very simple one? This is where the power of 0, 1, 2 works wonders. It's incredibly effective for a lot of things. And it's useful to think in these small steps, even if you end up with a development team saying, actually, we will use a library that supports all this. So for us, whether we add 1 device or 2 devices is the same, because that library supports it, for example. And if that's the case, fine, then we just collapse those. But it's much easier to start from smaller things and regroup them based on what is possible with technology, then go the other way around. Start with a big thing, and then, everything slows down because the technology doesn't allow it. So it's always worth thinking in small steps. So first do nothing, then 0, 1, 2 more. Another criteria is do the riskiest thing first. If you have that flow, you can look at it and say, okay, so what's the one part of the flow which has the most risk for us? And maybe it's in the beginning, maybe it's in the middle, maybe it's in the end. And then you think, okay, how about we start with that part? What would we need to do in order to test that users want to do this part. And then you start brainstorming and figure out a simple way of doing things so that you can implement and verify and test with users their behaviors. And then if this is successful, move to the next steps. And if it's not successful, you can always stop and say, okay, so our hypothesis was proven wrong. Our bet has failed. And it's perfectly fine because we have a lot of small bets. So if 1 in 100 bets or if 10 in 100 bets fails, not a big deal. We still have a lot of other bets that we are making, and we are bound to win about 10% of the bets anyway, or maybe more. So yeah, it's a basic hedging way of thinking. So these are a few criteria that you can use. And then you can also use another criteria, which is interesting in the sense that it's not necessary a story slicing criteria, but it's something that can help during this exercise. And that is, we can first deliver this to friendly users and or friends and family, or I don't know, friendly users from the same organization, and then expand to friendly users, you know, our biggest fans who are interested in experimental features, and then expand to a slightly larger base of clients, and then expand to the whole base of clients. And this is a way of slicing that I never thought of as being quite a user slicing technique, but it's actually very powerful, because if you look at a big flow and you realize, oh, this part in the middle is more risky, but in order to do that, we cannot deploy this to everybody because there will be some impact on the business. I don't know, they will speak on social media or tell other people what happened and stuff like that. But then what we can do is to say, okay, let's just deploy this to friendly users. And so you restrict the user story based on another criteria, which is what audience are we referring to. And we start with a friendly audience and then decide how to stage it later on. So these are some very useful criteria, and I think if you apply these techniques for your product development, a lot more things in Agile will start to make sense. Because if you enter into Agile with a mindset of project development, and we have a start date, we have an end date, we have these 200 tasks, 23 features that need to be done that translate into 200 tasks, and that's what we need, then you are obviously confused about how Agile applies in this environment. But the way it applies is when you realize that there are no requirements, only hypotheses, and that we want to test hypotheses as early as possible. And because of that, we can split our question, our hypothesis. We can do small experiments that verify or falsify the hypothesis. And that's the fundamental idea in Agile product development. If you can do that, and it's obviously not easy, there's obviously much more than what I'm telling you here, but if you can do things like that, then everything becomes much clearer. At least you understand why we are doing certain things and why certain things make sense in Agile. By the way, one very cool thing about large language model and the models and the surgeons of coding agents is that now you can generate prototypes pretty easily that you can test with users. And that's a big speed or big accelerator, let's say, because if you start with a hypothesis, you come up with an idea, you want to build a prototype, something that maybe a few years ago would take you days or maybe weeks, can now take like a few days with the help of a AI assistant. And of course, it won't be perfect. Of course, it will have bugs. It might have copyright and legal issues, but it's something that you can use to test value, to test the interest of users in specific features, in specific solutions. And then you throw it away and you implement it properly if it's validated. And if it's not validated, you just throw it away, right? So it should be less of an issue in this case. I'm ignoring I know all the other issues related to AI. So I'm just focusing on the practical aspects of using an AI, not on the other aspects of large language models. All right, so this is it for today. A few techniques for agile product development, a few techniques for user story slicing in your agile product development, particularly for teams who switch from projects to products and realize that the mindset needs to change. And by the way, we have specific learning program for this. So visit our website. What do you think about all this? Let us know in the comments. We love comments. I love to interact with you. And so let me know. What do you think about this? Are these techniques that you have used? Have you used other techniques? Do you have other questions about these topics? Let us know in the comments and I'll be sure to answer those. Thank you kindly for the view, and until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart. See you next Saturday.